Thank you Mountain Revenue 353 for allowing us to narrate their story. Humanity had been inducted into the greater universe 8 years ago and joined up with one of 3 major pantheons on this side of the infinity curve. They were a very strange addition, having almost no divine intervention in their daily lives. Humanity's God never spoke to his people. His people similarly never actually spoke to the God of humanity. Humans were unique among all known species. Statistically, they have an average height and average weight. The species has no sharp teeth or claws, and they were not born with an incredible intellect that could devise technological wonders or innate magical abilities. They thought magic was simple sleight of hand, up until wyverns started attacking their planet. Their world was also a death world, possessing a much higher radiation level than any other world on record. Their universe seemed to have radiation as a constant instead of an exception, and that rating was assigned before you even included the demon infestations. And unlike wyverns or vampires, demons did not kill, because that would be considered wrong. Instead, they merely enslaved your immortal soul, guiding you into the place between places where time was irrelevant, so that they could torment you for an eternity and a day in a short enough time span the demon could be home for supper. They were wholesome like that. If humans had any ability, it was their seemingly natural resistance to radiation and what appeared to be enough natural insanity to choose to live on their homeworld. Humans lived on a death world, but were not Deathworlders who possessed amazing physique and survivability. All things considered, the majority of species had simply warned their populations against traveling there and put a few regulations in place to discourage traveling back and forth. No one wanted a demon popping up in a dimensional port after all. The real issue was that a strangely high number of people had migrated to Earth. A shockingly high number. In fact, they were actually trying to investigate that right now. Why would anyone want to live there? That place is a shithole. Humans might get offended, but when the rest of the universe compared their current technological level to a type of medieval age, the planet truly was a bit of a shithole. They can't even cure epilepsy. What are you supposed to do if you want kids? Just hope they don't have any birth defects? Orpheus was standing there, listening to a small council talking about Earth. Obviously, a planet that couldn't cure diabetes or cancer was behind worlds that could. Obviously, a world with homeless was worse than a world without homeless. Even a human would say it was obvious that Earth was behind worlds that did not have demons infesting it. Yet, obviously, Earth was desirable because an extremely large number of people were migrating there. A very specific demographic seemed to find something they wanted that they couldn't find anywhere else. An elf sat at one end of the council's table. He had a tinge of gray in his hair that marked him as wildly older than Orpheus. Elves were known as great researchers, although their innate abilities, such as long lifespans, enhanced learning speeds, and their natural calm disposition, made them perfect to take advisor or leadership roles. The elven council member spoke, and everyone else quieted for a moment. The problem is that Deathworlders are moving to Earth in great enough numbers that we now require more to sustain our infrastructure. As a rule, Deathworlders were incredibly strong, as they generally evolved on inhospitable planets after either being abandoned or enslaved by their own higher powers. They could contend with a human-made tank, making them useful additions to any conflicts, and they made excellent firemen or other types of search and rescue members. By definition, they also did not have gods, or at least no gods that were devoted to them, who they could rely on for assistance when needed. That led to some rather tragic oversights on the council's part, namely, that if a population started abusing harpies, the harpy pantheon would show up and try to kill you. But since Deathworlders were a tiny portion of the population, that made it more difficult for their voices to be heard in the first place, and the lack of higher powers to represent them meant they had gone unappreciated for too long. The elf continued. So, as the leadership, we have obviously failed Deathworlders. I suggest we send someone to Earth so that we can learn what they are doing better. Orpheus, will you please step forward? Orpheus did as instructed. Yes, Councilman. You have voiced your interest in studying humanity and their planet with full knowledge of the dangers? The old elf asked. Yes, Councilman, Orpheus answered. I would like to give you a number of treasures to assist you in this endeavor. He turned to the side. Please bring the safe. A pair of lizard-like guards walked forwards, bearing a small safe between them. Their scales varied in color slightly, one being teal and the other a darker green. Cadians, created by the goddess of law for the purpose of acting as guards. They naturally understood the laws as written by the beings they worship, and their scales could withstand small-caliber, unenchanted weaponry. The two of them were also carrying a 400-pound safe with only minor discomfort, setting it down lightly. The elf dismissed the two productive members of society and held his palm against the safe for a moment before it clicked open. Cadians made perfect guards. Elves made perfect advisors. This safe had been made by people with abilities related to crafting. The alloy it was made of was nearly 20% stronger than it should have been, due to the species that created it, and that was before a number of other species worked to create a magical locking system. Until now, Deathworlders had been the perfect choice for any professions that needed to accept some degree of risk to themselves. It was often said the weakest Deathworlder could recover from any wound short of a beheading, though that was a bit of an exaggeration. They came from godless worlds with deadly ecosystems and environments that might outright kill a lesser species. People thought they were prone to violence and rash decisions. Until a few years ago, the Council would have agreed. Minotaurs, for example, came from a world that had been permanently damaged in a conflict with their god. It never rained, and food was rare, generally being sourced by monster spawn. Minotaurs had a stereotype of abducting people with abilities that revolved around the creation of water and food. A stereotype that held fairly true with migrants. The Council would have gone on about how they were better off without Deathworlders. They were criminals, capable of killing without a second thought. They were rapists and murderers, and now there were no firemen because Earth was doing something different from them, and their people loved Deathworlders. They needed to find species who could withstand the heat of an alchemical fire that was strong enough to tear through walls and carry people out of burning buildings. It was a tall order for magical protections. Fitting that much power into a singular suit of armor was difficult. Fitting in that and the ability to carry life-saving equipment for the people in the buildings. Impossible without using high-tier artifacts. I will give you this equipment, Orpheus. I also require for you to direct your attention to a few key points during your research into humanity. The elf pulled out a necklace, a helmet, a breastplate, greaves, boots, a buckler, a rapier, and a handful of wands and scepters. He just kept pulling more and more enchanted objects out of the safe. At some point, Orpheus stopped him. Showing up in plate armor with a magical sword that glowed purple would keep her safe. With this level of gear, she might be able to go head-to-head with a champion-level being, until the equipment lost its charge at least. The councilman really thought she could get accurate research on human society while shining in bright armor and carrying a glowing sword around. It would be like trying to study birds with an air horn. Everything would be either running away from her or returning mating calls. I am going to have to decline the enchanted gear, sir. It will get in the way of studying how humans react to ordinary sentient beings, Orpheus stated. It just went to show why elves were held in such light, keeping the bigger picture in mind, despite the treasures held in front of them. The councilman had not thought of that, merely hearing that she wanted to occupy a death world for an extended amount of time. Surely then there would be some equipment you should take. The elf rebounded from his failure quickly. I suppose you would want stealth-based equipment? Maybe items that people cannot perceive? If I carry expensive items with me, it may cause humans to desire such devices. I believe they may be desperate for such protections because of the wyvern issue a bit ago. Orpheus stated, being an elf would attract enough attention. Walking around with champion-level artifacts might attract champions who wanted said artifacts, and she was not under the belief she would win such a fight. There was no way she could keep a large number of high-level items secret forever. Another council member spoke up, a Canian who was in charge of the local guard force. Guards have a similar issue. We have an armory with some stored-up high-tier weaponry, but if we go handing them out to guardsmen without need, they have a tendency to get ambushed by rogues. Orpheus nodded. Go to a new world with only an early space age level of technology, wearing something that anyone on that planet would kill for? She would rather go naked. It would be safer. I believe relying on my own physical abilities would be for the best. Besides, I do not think any tier of weapon I could use could protect me from a demon. Aura clarified, demons were old and needed either specially trained priests or divine intervention to drive them away. Ordinarily, that would be true. However, the position we wish for you to assume requires that you be somewhat armed. The Canian put his claws together. We have spoken to the human guard force in their main port city, and they have agreed to give a position to a person of our choosing. And you wish for me to take this position? Arafis tried to clarify. It wouldn't quite be an anonymous observer, but being in a guard force could have its own benefits. A councilwoman who hadn't spoken yet added her opinion. Yes, I am hoping you will accept. We have voted that you would be the most suited. Arafis didn't have to think about it long. I accept. The armor was still sitting there on the table. The old elf hadn't put it away yet. The helmet shined like gold, and she could see the parts of the table that was in direct contact, taking on a golden sheen. The breastplate was floating half an inch off the surface it had been placed on. Because it was so heavy, it would smash through the furniture and floor before burying itself deep within the earth below. The sword glowed purple, and every few moments a small barrier would intercept something from the blade with a faint crackle. She could identify each of these pieces of equipment. Arafis took a step forward, and when the councilman nodded, she picked up the necklace, an amulet that appeared to be made of stones, with similar dimensions as quarters. There was no string. The stones were bound together by something intangible. Then she backed away from the rest of the gear. Everything that had been brought out was too high level for her. Anyone strong enough to appraise her equipment with a glance would think of her like a mimic that just stepped out of an armory. A walking loot box. Where can I read more about passive studies on deadly worlds, Arafis? The older elf asked with a hint of disgruntlement. No one liked being wrong, but elves were supposed to at least have a general knowledge of just about everything. I would suggest looking into the series, First Contact with the Narrate. It goes over the various methods and their strengths and weaknesses. Arafis answered near instantly. In the typical elven fashion, the series was more akin to a textbook, describing the many failures and deaths, closer to an autopsy report. Most species wrote those same books in the style of a horror series. Marids are giant spider people. The Canian walked over and put a hand on Arafis' shoulder. Hey. He stuck a thumb up. Good luck. Okay, guards. Or I guess police in this case aren't an easy profession to get into. If you stick it out and do a good job, though, you can get more than just a paycheck out of this. He shook her hand and walked away. Next was the elf. Arafis could tell he was slightly miffed to be second in line, but he held his emotions in check, well enough that only another elf could tell. Keep safe. I held you once when you were small. Remember, your goal is secondary to your life. He too shook her hand and left. Elves didn't reproduce quickly. Most elves did in fact know each other. The councilmen lined up, each giving a quick handshake and a few words of wisdom. Remember, Earth knows little to nothing about magic. They may overreact if you cast even weaker spells, but you may be able to intimidate people who are much stronger than you. A councilwoman with blue skin and horns shook her hand. She was the head of arcane studies. A man with stony skin engulfed her hand with his. Learning about humans is important, but many primitive civilizations do have unacceptable traditions. Be sure to represent our actual interests. Marids no longer ate people. Flesh shapers had to learn how illegal, cruel, and unusual punishments were, and she was fairly sure humans agreed that nailing people to crosses was wrong now. Civilizations looked back 100 years and thought of themselves as lesser, looking at all the mistakes they made, the problems they could have solved. Humans would be no different. Learning about humans was important, but so was ensuring they weren't acting regrettable. And in this case, her people would adapt from humans too. The final councilman, an architect, finished shaking her hand and left. She would be briefed after this on what the council wanted to learn from the humans, their progress of a number of illegal magical practices, information on a few key individuals, their type of government, and how their basic society operated. but most importantly, how to properly care for Deathworlders. It was obvious that their people depreciated the Deathworlders. How did you make your society appreciate 7-foot-tall people who could snap your spine with a rough movement? The same people who were known for being reflexively violent. It was important for the good of their society, and for once, the entire council was focused on this task. And it wasn't just this territory's council. The vast majority of leaders across multiple worlds were focusing on this issue. They would solve the issue, because their military had made the consequences for losing Deathworlder support very clear.